joined here today with Dr. Hasan Azad, who holds a PhD from the Columbia University in philosophy and religion, to discuss a recent paper of his on spirituality, technocracy, and the illusion of freedom.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you, Saad, for the introduction. So, I wanted, before launching into the the paper per se, I had a very sort of quick some quick thoughts on the question of backgrounds, right? I mean, we're living the Zoom life today, right? It's Zoom life through and through, and I know we're both very conscious of the backgrounds, right? The background that we have behind, as far as what can be seen and what can't be seen. And it occurred to me to make mention and to think through this question that, as far as you can tell, I have a nice, my background's pretty decent. It's well thought out. I have a nice orchid. I have some decent lighting behind me, etc., etc. It's presentable, right? As is the case for your background. It's a nice background. You don't, of course, see the messiness around me. Like, I have a really messy table. It's just, I'm, I guess a stereotypical, in many ways, academic thinker, philosopher, where everything's a big mess. Now, how is this relevant to this particular presentation? Well, thinking through the question of paradigms and worldviews, right? Paradigms are such that they necessarily allow certain things through the window, as it were, and they necessarily disallow other things, right? And my sort of thinking in this regard, I'm drawing on people like Michel Foucault and others. Michel Foucault has a very powerful notion of the unconscious of knowledge. He argues that in each historical time period, there is a type of unconscious of knowledge through which we think through, and this, by virtue of the fact being the unconscious of knowledge, it's literally it's not something we're aware of on a day-to-day basis, and perhaps it is actually difficult for us to always be aware of consciously at all times all the sort of paradigms, all the sort of assumptions, the worldviews, as it were, that go into shaping our very thought structures, right? But as thinkers, I would contend, as serious thinkers, if we are to make that claim, we have to always, to the best of our ability, be questioning these assumptions. And of course, this is a significant part of Foucault's project, right? He's sort of raising serious question marks about the modern project as such. And hopefully I'd like to come back to this as we progress, this question of the paradigm as such. Now, on the question of spirituality, I had a sort of, as it were, a cursory sort of reflection. And what I'll do is I'll look individually. I have some notes that I'll be referring to as I'm going along. I'll look at the question of spirituality. I'll look at the question of technocracy, and then finally the illusion of freedom. And hopefully I'll do sort of a wraparound towards the end and bring it together. As far as the question of spirituality, I'm really inspired, at least now, but even outside of this context, by the famous, and perhaps not sufficiently famous given how brilliant he was, metaphysician, philosopher of the 20th century, who was French, Rene Genoa, and his symbolism, his interpretation and reading of the symbolism of the cross. He argued, Rene Genoa, who, interestingly enough, this isn't widely, sufficiently widely known also, that he was a convert to Islam. And I know, Saad, that you're aware of this, but many people aren't aware of this fact. He was a convert to Islam, spent much of his later life in Egypt, passed away in Egypt as a Muslim, buried as a Muslim. I mention this because Many Muslims may raise the question, oh, well, why are you talking about the symbolism of the cross? Why is this relevant to us as Muslims? Well, Rene Genoa, when he was speaking about whether the symbolism of the cross or looking at traditional Hindu metaphysics, he interestingly enough wrote more about Hindu metaphysics than anything else, which I think is a fascinating fact of history, again, as a practicing Muslim. Nevertheless, so when he wrote and spoke about the symbolism of the cross, he was trying to bring out its more, as it were, universal aspects, so it can be applicable and usable for people regardless of their outward sort of religious affiliations. So he, as I'm sure you're aware, Saad, but for those who aren't aware, when he spoke about the symbolism of the cross, he looked at the horizontal aspect of the cross, which clearly has a horizontal aspect, which is pierced by a vertical dimension. And as you know, Saad, he sort of makes the point, a very profound point, which is that the horizontal dimension is always pierced by the vertical dimension. And as people of faith, as people who are spiritually and religiously inclined, we must always avail ourselves of that reality. We can always turn to the vertical dimension. And we always, not only can, we always must return to the vertical. As long as we are focused on the horizontal, we are doomed. Any solutions that we come up with as human beings that are only focused on the horizontal dimensions are ultimately doomed. This is kind of my addition to the story, but it's really drawing and building on Rene Genoa and other great thinkers like him. So with that very sort of initial sketch, as it were, of the concept of spirituality, I'd like to shift now to the question of technocracy. And my sort of working definition for technocracy is that it is a rule, or sort of not a rule, but rule as such, by a technological elite. And as we now know increasingly, as I've been aware for a number of years now, because this has kind of been my obsession, as it were, looking at technology, digital technologies in particular, how they sort of penetrate our lives in some very profound ways, and increasingly so. But more and more studies are speaking to this. The relatively recent documentary that got a lot of airtime, and understandably so, on Netflix, called The Social Dilemma, right? The brilliant study by Shoshana Zuboff, really landmark study by this, she's a professor emeritus at Harvard. She's being compared to Marx, which is not a small comparison for people to make, with her study, as a result of a study called Surveillance Capitalism, in which she very convincingly argues, looking at the nature of digital technologies and how they are constantly mining us for all our data and surveilling us 24/7, that the capitalism that they're tied to is really, it turns us into the product, right? It's not just a case that these technologies are designed so that they can give us the best products that we can possibly design. It's not only that, and that's an aspect of it, and maybe it started off like that, but now significantly, we ourselves are being molded in very subtle and sometimes not sometimes, very often, very sophisticated ways that are not even within our ken. And these are questions that we need to be thinking more and more about. And of course, these technologies are run by elites. There's no question about it. We're talking about billionaires, multimillionaires, people who are pushing the trillionaire mark now, right? People like Jeff Bezos, who, let's not forget, I mean, he's famous for owning Amazon, but Amazon, one of Amazon's major money-making machines is AWS, Amazon Web Services. So they're actually a major player in this sort of digital realm, and it's been written about in over the years that the so-called big five, the major big tech companies are Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. And of course, this is a Eurocentric reading of things, because it's not taking into account the very major players in China. Which that's something we need to also take into account. Nevertheless, so my thinking along these lines is, and I'm not necessarily saying anything that original, which is that our very humanity, how we view ourselves, how we view each other, how we view the rest of the world, is shaped in an increasingly all-pervasive fashion by these technologies, by these digital technologies. And we're going through a very interesting moment, a moment which has been predicted, right? One can say for a long time now by people in this sphere, in the digital sphere. They've been saying for the longest time, look, it's just a matter of time before we collectively make a massive shift towards digitality, which I define digitality as a mode of being and thinking which is mediated significantly again through digital technologies. They've been saying, say for instance, vis-a-vis universities themselves, the traditional brick and mortar university, they've been predicting, these technologists and people who've been reading the signs on the horizon, right, that it's just a matter of time before the brick and mortar university system itself is radically restructured and reconfigured because of these digital technologies. And of course, 2020 has brought about a lot of these changes. I remember a few months ago now, Eric Schmidt, one of the founders of Google and a very big player again in all of this, he was mentioning in an interview he gave for was it CNN, some sort of news channel, but he's not the only one to say this. He was making the observation, which is not an insignificant observation, that we, and people use the word we, but it's, anyway, we can come back to that. He was saying that we have achieved 10 years worth of changes in a matter of 6 months. And that is, I mean, we should all reflect on that. We should take a moment to reflect on that. 10 years worth of changes in 6 months. That is not a good thing. I assure all of us that can never be a good thing. And we know, sorry, were you going to say something?
Changes in terms of what exactly?
Well, exactly. So in terms of how the society is structured, right? So how people do business, how people are living their lives, as far as the mass adoption of digital technologies, right? And this is something that has been in the works for a long time, right? And it just happens to be the case that the circumstances around 2020 with COVID and so forth have allowed for the mass sort of rolling out of a lot of these technologies, right? One of the major sort of areas of investment for many of these companies, whether Facebook or otherwise, is in the realm of VR technology, right? Virtual reality, and that hasn't been rolled out in a major way yet. The sort of subsidiary company owned by Facebook is in this regard is called Oculus. It was originally Oculus Rift, and they shortened the name to Oculus. Which is a VR company, right? And I was thinking for a long time, before sort of pre-COVID, right, pre-2020, I was like, what would it take, or why would people even adopt VR, right? It just doesn't make any sense. Like, we have a physical world. Like, I get, being online can be fun and cool, but it's still like, we're dealing with a very clunky sort of screen, and it doesn't feel real, really, no matter how good the sort of the pixel numbers and things like that. And then I'm like, oh, of course, if we're forced to, for whatever, whatever the however it's come about, if we're forced to be indoors 24/7, and then VR technology is rolled out, and it hasn't been rolled out fully yet, but I think it's certainly just a matter of time, right? This is I'm not saying anything original here. We know this is coming. Then clearly people are going to adopt it, right? If we literally can't see people face to face, like now, I mean, I've never met you in person, Saad, of course, but and so this is the paradox of technology as well. It's a double-edged sword, that it both allows certain things that perhaps previously weren't allowed or possible. But by the same token, at the same time, it disallows certain things, right? So on the one hand, the very fact that we have digital technology allows me to interface with you, Saad. You're in Qatar right now, and I'm in the UK. And in fact, we met online, and we met a few years ago, and we've only ever connected online. So that's the possibility that's created through digital technologies. But then I can't help but wonder what other possibilities and realities are being disallowed by the fact that we have digital technologies. Right? People more and more spend more and more time online than they often do in real person interactions, right? And I certainly am guilty of this, and I'm sure many of us are, right? And I think this is a reality that's only going to intensify as time progresses. In any case, sticking a little bit with the question of technocracy, but also edging a little bit also into the third dimension, which is the illusion of freedom. I was thinking through a little bit the brilliant French philosopher who was writing some decades ago. He passed away a while ago now. Who was Catholic by religious persuasion, Jacques Ellul, who wrote on technology and how really the dark sides of technology that aren't sufficiently thought about. And he makes the point that in traditional cultures, in pre-modern cultures, technologies, the different technologies that existed, because I mean, look, as human beings, we know we've always had technologies, whether it was the very first rudimentary, this is kind of based on an evolutionary model, sociological model of things, the most rudimentary flint sort of tools and things like that. I mean, we've always had technologies, right, in some shape or form. Fire, it said, was one of the first technologies that allowed us to sort of not have to spend so much digesting food anymore, right? The digestion happened now, as it were. The process of digestion happened through the cooking process, so we could have shorter alimentary canals and things like that, and spend more energy doing other things like thinking. So technology's always existed, but the important thing to remember, and this is coming from someone like Jacques Ellul, which is that traditionally in pre-modern societies, technologies were such that they changed over very long, their changes happened very slowly, right? And he sort of says, look, a technology could be around for 100 years before it actually undergoes any major shift. And then he also makes the point, because he's he's a very serious thinker, he makes the point that these technologies, they had the dimension, they suffered from a degree of inefficiency, right? However, they made up for their lack of inefficiency with stability, right? Stability as to both the technology itself, but also the society that, the social relations that developed around these technologies, right? And he makes further the very important point that historically, knowledges and wisdom was carried down, of course, from generation to generation, very often in an oral form, but not only in an oral form. And that wisdom was something that was gleaned through, of course, through reflection and serious pondering on the realities around us, through a very dynamic and lived relationship with nature. It wasn't a theoretical thing, right? Very often now, those of us who like to think about these things and talk about these things as far as our relationship to nature, it's a theoretical notion. It's a very kind of romanticized notion. Oh, we should communicate and commune with nature more. But for pre-modern peoples, it was a lived reality, right? And his point is that with modern technologies, what happens is they're rapidly sort of modified and changed to the point where serious reflection becomes almost impossible. And he uses the metaphor of the car to illustrate this point. And it's, again, he's a serious thinker, so he's a fair thinker. He says, look, if I'm driving down the road at 80 miles an hour, I don't have, I cannot possibly reflect on what, if someone jumps out in front of me, it has to be a reflex reaction, right?
Mm.
So, but the problem with modern technology is it primarily, amplifies the reflexivity of our being as opposed to the reflectiveness of our being. And this is a very, very important aspect as far as I'm concerned, as far as thinking about these modern technologies, right? So shifting a little bit to the question of the illusion of freedom, as I'm sort of calling it, I'm sort of dependent again significantly on people like Michel Foucault, as you know, Saad. Foucault I consider to be one of my great teachers in all seriousness, in no small fashion. I mean, I owe him massively, existentially. If it were not for Foucault, honestly, I don't even know if I'd be around today. That's not even an exaggeration, as I know you know, Saad. And without going into too much detail about that, but his very, very important contribution to the question of freedom, right? He's not necessarily explicitly thinking about these terms, but he's questioning the modern project, right? Because, and I have a couple of props by the way of books, right? But and I'll bring that out in a second. But Foucault is questioning the modern product, the modernist project, which is that we are these freely thinking sovereign individuals, right? Which is part of the mythos of modernity. He raises question marks around that, and it occurred to me recently to remember that, of course, famously, who ushers in, at least through his enunciations, the watershed moment is through Rene Descartes, right? Rene Descartes, when he says, I think therefore I am. And I think I lost you. So when Rene Descartes famously says, I think cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, the assumption is that he is a freely thinking sovereign subject, right? Because, I mean, as we know, to remind ourselves what his project, and he's thinking as a believer, right? He's thinking as a Christian. He's asking the question, as we remember in his meditations, that what is the only thing that I can speak of with absolute certainty, right? I can't take my sense impressions on face value. They can be brought into question. I certainly can't take, sort of biblical religious revelation, as it were, on face value. The only thing he contends, that he can say with absolute certainty is real is his own thinking, right? I think, therefore I am. Now, the assumption here, in some ways unspoken assumption with Descartes' pronouncement, is that he is a freely thinking individual, right? There isn't the assumption built into this. He's not raising question marks as to the degree to which his very own thinking self is already shaped by these societal and structural conditions into which he's born, right? And this becomes a significant part of the sort of post-structuralists project, right? People such as Foucault and others, they're raising major question marks about these assumptions of the sovereign individual, right? So Foucault famously, and this is probably his most famous work, of course, Discipline and Punish. Yeah. He talks about the modern project of the modern disciplinary structural mechanisms that go into the formation of our subjectivities, right? So he has famously this notion of subjectivation, right? Which is that the human subject is always already, to use that sort of Derridean formula, is always already formed again by the conditions, material and otherwise, into which he or she is born. And perhaps the most well-read section in Discipline and Punish is the section on the Panopticon, right? So to remind ourselves, the Panopticon is this sort of idealized, perfected prison system, which is designed by the famous and very influential British thinker Jeremy Bentham, in which, according to Bentham's formulation and drawings, is it's an ideal prison system that only requires a single central watchtower, which is surrounded by cells which are backlit, and the people who are in the cells can't see who's in the watchtower, but the guard, the prison guard, can always be watching anyone at any point. And of course, the logic of the system is so profound and powerful because the inmates, the prisoners, they internalize the logic of the system, so they're always they're always self-regulating, right? Because what if someone is watching me, right? Now, the Panopticon, according to Foucault's analysis, becomes the symbol of modern institutions as such. So the Panopticon isn't only applied to the prison system, it's applied to schools, factories, and on and on. And of course, now we know through work such as Shoshana Zuboff, but not only, I mean, we've known this for some time, those of us who do study these things, we've known that the Panopticon is, the metaphor of the Panopticon is omnipresent. The very fact that, these revelations came about through Edward Snowden and others, right, that anyone could be watching us through even our cameras. And this is not conspiracy theory or paranoia, right? It's literally possible that people do hack in to people's computers and watch them and record them and so forth. And this is, again, part of the surveillance system that we all find ourselves in. So we have to really ask serious question marks about the extent to which we are actually free, right? I would contend, and I do contend, a la Foucault and others, that our freedom, the notion of freedom that we have, it's a very sort of, again, a modern, in particular, liberal, it's a liberal conceit, right? It's a modern Western liberal conceit that we are free agents, right? And it's up to us as individuals, as sovereign individuals, to choose for ourselves whatever we think is best for ourselves, right? As long as, and then as the sort of the discourse and discussion goes, as long as I'm not sort of infringing on anyone else's rights and freedoms, then, so in theory that sounds good, but that again assumes that we are truly free, and I would contend, and others have argued, that we're not free. And I want to raise additional questions in this regard vis-a-vis freedom as such. And this is already quite an old book by this point, right? It's Chomsky's and co-authored by Edward S. Herman, Manufacturing Consent. This is quite an old and very well respected and widely accepted work, in which Chomsky and Herman, they sort of unpack, when they're writing this, was in the late 80s, I forget now exactly. So a while ago, they were analyzing, they were looking at print media, because print media was a big thing then, and looking to what extent these media, these print and television media as well, of course, that they were not really so much interested in cultivating free discourse, right, so much as they were interested in creating a framework for discussion, right, which ultimately favored the people who advertised with them, right? So in other words, moneyed interests, right? So the question becomes, whose interests are being favored, and to what extent are we truly free thinkers within this society? So Chomsky was in an interview who was asked, whose consent is being manufactured, right? And this is a very profound comment on Chomsky's part when he makes the point, well, there are actually two tiers of people whose consent are being manufactured. The first and most important tier is that of the ruling class, the educated class rather. The educated class of people like yourself, Saad, and myself, we're educated people. We're both doctors, right? So we have like, as it were, not just as it were, we literally have the highest sort of recognition educationally in this society, right? So people like us who are basically, we oversee, at the way the system is structured, it's understood that we're meant to oversee what gets classed as legitimate knowledge and what gets classed as illegitimate knowledge, right? And Chomsky makes the point that it's this class of people that is in particular significantly targeted. And then latterly, but also not insignificantly, is the class of people who are basically the to use a phrase that gets bandied about by an interesting group of people, in some ways, the useless eaters, right? People who basically, they go about their daily lives eating and drinking and making some money and watching, you know, the latest sort of TV programs. And that's not my term, by the way. It's a term that's used by you know, it's theorized by so-called conspiracy theorists, but this is the term that's actually used for most of the world's population by these super global elite people, which will bring us to another discussion about, you know, whether there's a conspiracy or not, and I don't know to what extent we'll necessarily find ourselves in that discussion. But I want to sort of now touch upon in relation to, you know, the notion of conspiracies and what have you, this book which I've just started to read, which is called COVID-19, The Great Reset. And it's not written by conspiracy theorists. It's written by, co-authored by the head of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, who's a PhD, and another PhD, I think he's an economist teaching somewhere in Europe, Thierry Malaret, right? And I've just started to read this, and I'm sort of making my way through it. And I looked in particular, so in other words, well, I'm looking in particular at what they are predicting is already happening vis-a-vis human changes, right? The massive sort of reset, as they're using the terminology themselves, in particular vis-a-vis digital transformation, right? And they are saying it has to be, quote, a remote everything, right? They're calling COVID-19, whatever we're going through in 2020 currently, as being a catalyst for bringing about these changes, right? Speaking to the point that I made earlier about the Google as exec's pronouncement, right? Eric Schmidt's pronouncement that we've achieved 10 years worth of changes in 6 months. Well, they're talking again about these digital transformations, right? So, and again, these people, right, who have massive influence, let's not forget, and they have a massive, and influence means money as well, right? So they're movers and shakers in the world. They get to, through their very money, in many instances, get to decide how the rest of us are going to live our lives. Rightly or wrongly, they're saying, look, this is the changes that we're seeing brought about as a result of at the same time as COVID-19, right? And what's the kind of famous adage, political adage in the context of politics, which is never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So however the crisis came about, this crisis certainly not being allowed to go to waste. So I want to raise question marks for myself and others that we need to think critically about what we're going through this moment, which in the MIT Technology Review, which is, again, not an insignificant publication, it's a very well-moneyed, very influential publication that the movers and shakers, again, in the world, they refer to. And they had an article that was written by, and I shared this a few times and I've revisited it a couple of times, published on March 17th of this year, written by the editor-in-chief of MIT Technology Review, and the title was, and the title is telling, "We're never going back to normal." Right. The editor-in-chief's name is Gideon Litchfield. So these things are some of the questions that I'd like to leave us with, and maybe open up the discussion for. And before concluding, I wanted to bring it back to the question of the spiritual dimension, right, and the initial sort of reflection that I had through Rene Genoa, because many people may be asking and wondering, and I certainly ask and wonder, so what is the solution, and what are we to do, right? Are we just hopeless? Excuse me, are we just helpless in the face of these sort of massive forces that are at work, and these machines and things like that? And I would argue that from a spiritual point of view, we're never hopeless and helpless, right? That ultimately the spiritual message at all times, through the symbolism of the cross, again, is that the horizontal dimension, if we stay within the horizontal dimension, we're doomed. Absolutely, we're hopeless. Absolutely, we're helpless. Because we can, you know, you and I and others can spend our entire lives arguing and debating and worrying and fretting about these things which are real. I mean, I don't want to downplay the reality of this stuff, right? And I think it's important as thinkers, as serious thinkers, thinking through some of these issues, that we're not idealistic about things, that we're not romantics, right? But at the same time, we shouldn't be pragmatists at the expense of being idealists, i.e., spiritual idealists. So it should be, you know, a marrying of the two. And so we come back to the spiritual ideal, which is the vertical dimension is always present for us, and we, every single one of us, even the Klaus Schwabs, even the you know, Eric Schmidts and what have you, the Bill Gates, and each and every one of us, we're all made in the image of God at the end of the day, to use Christian language, right? We're all caliphs of God, to use Quranic language, right? We all have the divine within us, to use sort of more Hindu notion, right? No matter who we are, we should always be returning to the vertical dimension, and that is the great challenge. That is the perennial challenge for us as human beings, yeah, and it's a big challenge, but it's worth it. It's worth the struggle. So yeah, that's kind of what I had to say on that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it leaves so many areas. I mean, it leads to so many areas for discussion, of course. I think at the start, can we maybe delve a bit on the relationship of the horizontal with the vertical? Uh, because if uh, the vertical dimension, I mean, the first question, of course, is where can it be found?
Very important, yes.
And
yes.
And I mean, if we consider the great traditions of the world uh, as the reservoirs of this vertical dimension, then I think I had once read in James Cutsinger, who's also an Eastern Orthodox scholar, the late Dr. James Cutsinger. I mean, his definition of tradition was something which I found very attractive. He said that tradition is uh, the vertical represents for him the moment of revelation or of the contact of the divine in the finite world, and tradition is the attempt to later to preserve that vertical when it came as closer as closest as possible in that sense. So I mean, do you think these traditions are what we should be looking at?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. Thank you for that. Something I do think a lot about. I would say yes and no, right? Yes, insofar as to resonate with James Cutsinger and others within the traditional school, people like Genoa, people like Frithjof Schuon, Said Hussein Nasr, Martin Lings, Titus Burkhardt, Cutsinger, of course. Marco Pallas, these great luminaries, incredible thinkers. So they argue absolutely that the only way in which we can relate to the divine and along the vertical axis is through tradition as such, tradition with a capital T, these sort of major traditions, right, that we know of, because they're this, as it were, the most perfect, they've preserved most perfectly that sort of relationship, right? So I would agree with that, but with a caveat, right? The caveat being this. I think institutions, by their very nature, anything that becomes institutionalized, it has the problem of power creeping into it. And this is a sort of Foucauldian idea, sort of power, the power knowledge dyad. We have, say, someone like Dalal Assad talking about this in his quite old now at this point, but very influential again, essay on the idea of the discursive tradition in Islam, in which he argues, without necessarily citing Foucault, but I think influenced by Foucault. I mean, he sort of is explicitly more, he gives more explicit credit to Wittgenstein in his sort of formulations. Nevertheless, he talks about, he looks at how orthodoxy, right, that notion, the sort of correct way of thinking, right, correct orthodoxy is literally correct thought in a religious context, right? He looks at how orthodoxy develops in an Islamic context, right? In particular, that, you know, he's an anthropologist within the Islamic context, and he argues quite convincingly, I think, that through history, what we witness is, you know, we have sort of peripheral marginal voices, right? And they're kind of kept in the margins by the orthodox sort of canonical almost thinkers, right? Let's take the Sunni example alone, because if we bring in the Shia aspect, that complicates things further. But even staying within the Sunni context, we have, and this we see in Ghazali, for instance. Ghazali was an orthodox thinker because he was payrolled, he was bankrolled by the powers of his time, which is an interesting historical fact that we can't deny, right? With no, I mean, with due respect to Ghazali as a thinker, he was a brilliant thinker, but we cannot overlook the fact that he was bankrolled, right? And yes, he had his incredible sort of 14-year, I think, however long it was, sort of spiritual sort of journey where he completely left everything and came back. In any case, the earlier Ghazali is very different from the later Ghazali, which is an interesting fact as well, right? Nevertheless, my point being, when orthodoxy is formulated, it is very often done in relationship to the centers of power. And what happens over the course of time, this is Asad's point, we have the marginal voices, which are both marginalized, but sometimes they keep themselves marginalized, right? Which is echoing, in which we have echoes of the prophetic tradition, that if the ruler, vis-a-vis the scholar, right? If the ruler comes in through one door of the scholar's house, the scholar should leave through the other door, right? If only we could see people, the scholars, the so-called scholars we have today, without mentioning any names, if only we saw them applying that one hadith, right? We'd have a very different situation these days. Anyway, money is a big problem. So these marginal voices, very often they have an impact on the centers of power and thought. And so very often there's like a dialectical relationship. And over time, what happens, not always, but often it does happen, the marginal voices become the dominant voice, right? Or influence it to such a degree that they become part of the orthodoxy, right? But then the cycle is repeated. Now then orthodoxy becomes stultified. Anyway, all of this is to say that absolutely, I believe that our best bet is turning to any one of these major traditions, whether, and it's, well, it's not down to me. I mean, this is my understanding of things. Like, that's our best bet, but I don't think it's a guarantee of anything. Because how often do we see very creative voices and people who are questioning, raising legitimate questions vis-a-vis the orthodox narrative of things, or orthodox narratives, being silenced, sometimes violently so. And this happens all the time. There are countless examples of this happening as we speak in Muslim countries and otherwise, right? I mean, and this is a historical fact. And I'm reminded also, and I'll finish with very soon on this point, I'm reminded also of the very profound uh, 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 um, thinker and luminary, without whom in many ways we can't even think of Islamic thought today, which is Ibn Arabi, right? Sheikh al-Akbar, who's called by his own followers and students Sheikh al-Akbar, who had the very interesting distinction of at the same time being called not only the greatest teacher by his students and followers, but also being called the greatest blasphemer, or the greatest person who'd gone astray, right? Which is a fascinating distinction. And to me, that is actually quite illustrative or indicative for me of someone who actually was onto something very true, right? This Ibn Arabi, Sheikh al-Akbar, ended up having to flee from place to place because he was so opposed because of his apparently controversial ideas. He died in the end in Damascus. He was originally from Murcia, Spain, in today's Spain. And I mention him because he had this idea, which I think is a very traditional Islamic notion. Oh, and the influence and the importance of Ibn Arabi has been studied since then. There are academic works on this, that Sufism and of course there's no Islamic thought really without Sufism. We know this, those of us who've studied this, and I know you have, Saad. Sufism post Ibn Arabi and Islamic intellectual output is either explicitly or implicitly going back to Ibn Arabi, going through Ibn Arabi. According to Said Hussein Nasser, Ibn Arabi wasn't doing anything new. He wasn't being about an innovation, but he was like the ultimate, and for his time, the ultimate. He represented the sort of the summation of mystical metaphysical speculation up until that point. So he becomes hugely influential, and his idea of when we read the Quran, he says, when we read the Quran, we should imagine that the Quran is being revealed to us at that very moment, revealed to us, to me, not just the Prophet, but to me. So to my mind, that sort of introduces a very interesting aspect to this discussion, which is true for mysticism as such, right? In all the mystical traditions, whether Islamic, whether Christian, Hindu, and on, is that there is a type of renewal in each figure. Each human being has the potential of renewal and bringing something, as it were, not innovative, because innovation is a problematic notion, right, in the Islamic context, but in Islamic vocabulary, but bringing something, I mean, renewal really captures it, but reviving something that's been lost, right, and questioning the powers that be, having this questioning attitude, right? So we should always have a degree of, I'm somewhat contradicting myself now in saying, if I'm about to say, which I will say, we should have a degree of freedom and independence, right? And so it's problematic. I get that, but I think you see where I'm going.
Yeah, of course. I'd also like to really get to talk more about freedom and, of course, technocracy and those things. But just one more point on this issue before we move on. This actually reminded me of Ibrahim Musa's got this book on Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination. And in the beginning, he talks about the how orthodoxy. Hello?
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm here.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes. Sorry.
No worries. So Ghazali and the Poetics
of
of
course.
Imagination.
Yeah. I mean, the comparison that you were making is something I find I found him making as well, where on the one side you have this, for example, Sayyid Hussein Nasr's idea of orthodoxy, and on the other hand, Talal Asad's idea of orthodoxy, and he was comparing these two. And I mean, of course, Dr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr famously also says that there is nothing more timely than the timeless.
Right.
I'm sure you've heard of this as well.
Yes, yes, yes.
But of course, the other dimension to that is the timeless itself is within time.
Exactly. Right.
And, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it must always be perceived with. I mean, we must always have both the eyes open.
Exactly.
In that
Exactly.
sense,
Exactly. I think that's a very profound point. Yeah. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah.
Moving on to one thing you're mentioning about Descartes and the sovereign self.
Yeah.
And of course, I suppose modern subjectivity is at the heart of what you're trying to talk about.
Right.
And the heart of that modern subjectivity is this conception of the self as a sovereign or as an autonomous entity.
Right.
And Descartes himself, I mean, for example, another postmodern religious philosopher, John Caputo. I'm sure you're familiar with,
No.
if you might have heard of him.
No. No.
He works on hermeneutics and postmodern theology. And I mean, of course, what he was also saying is that, I mean, Descartes' principal oversight was that, of course, he was using language.
Right.
And language itself is not something, without a context or a community of, I mean, in those things. And within it, I mean, it has its, I mean, the idea that you can begin with a blank slate or a neutral ground, or that there can be this view from nowhere.
Right.
You can, I mean, that itself is very problematic on many levels, and I think that also tends to
untenable. Absolutely. Yeah.
Of course, yeah. And I think that view also tends to be very imperialistic when you think that you are looking at things from this point of view that is purely objective, and everyone else is taking subjective stands over there. Then you feel that you are entitled to impose your view over there, and you.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. No, this is a very important point. And to your point also vis-a-vis language, so what is also fascinating to reflect is those of us who are bilingual or trilingual or what have you, we soon realize, and I saw a post on this point also just today on Facebook as it happens. This is something I've been thinking about for a while. And people who in the realm of translation and, translation theory and things like that, we know that it's actually literally impossible to translate exactly from one language to another. It's always not only an approximation, but a very poor one at that. Like it means something. As someone who speaks Bengali, for instance, I've made note of this at various times, that when I speak Bengali, I am it's not just that language is a vehicle through which I express myself, but any language is inseparable from its long history, right? Its cultural background, it's all this and other. So it's almost like I'm stepping into a mode of being, which is Bengali, as it were. So I think differently almost. I become someone different when I speak Bengali versus when I speak English. And then that narrative is problematized even further when I'm like shifting between languages, even in the course of one discussion. So the point being, right, there can, I mean, just to echo your point, right, that it's a very problematic notion, right, to think that we can somehow be outside of language, that we can somehow be outside of history, right, because no one is outside of history or language unless, of course, but then even that is problematic, right? Unless we are in this sort of state of fana, right? In the state of complete annihilation where there is no time, where there is no space. But then, I mean, Sufi, and I believe there is such a thing as fana, right? I believe there is such a thing as annihilation. How many of us can actually achieve that? That's a question that I'm very skeptical about. I think this is an ideal we should always be striving towards. This is the prophetic ideal, according to the Sufis of the past. Even Iqbal, right? He sort of famously talks about fana, but he sort of emphasizes the importance of baqa, right? Iqbal's sort of pronouncement on this is that the Sufis made a mistake. People like Ibn Arabi and others, right? They made the mistake of excessively sort of aggrandizing the notion of fana. It should be in a state of rootedness in baqa, because that was the prophetic model. The prophet came back to society. Anyway, I'm kind of digressing now, but anyway, let's move on.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Iqbal is a very fascinating figure for these reasons. And I think in that sense, his idea would also mirror a very Foucauldian idea of the self, because um, I mean, I mean, when from one point of view, the Sufi ideal, I mean, at least as it is uh, famously talked about, the Sufi ideal of fana uh, almost visualizes itself in a state of timelessness, and the tradition again is also then by extension visualized in a sense of timelessness. Uh, and the self is just something that I mean the true self is just something which exists timelessly, and that you just have to realize it. Whereas for Iqbal, the idea is not so much of self annihilation as of uh, self cultivation, and through self cultivation you become God. I mean, of course, the aim is, of course, to become God or to inculcate the qualities of God, as the hadith says. But his emphasis is not on eradicating the self, this sense of self that you have, but on purifying it and perfecting it. I mean, of course, the insani kamil that you get is very similar to, I mean, in Iqbal, it is very similar to the Nietzschean superego.
Yeah. Now, of course, and Nietzsche speaks very highly of Nietzsche and draws significantly. And his metaphor, Iqbal's metaphor, as you know, that he likes to use is that of the pearl, right? So as opposed to, rather than becoming the sort of wave that loses its, or rather than the drop of water sort of becoming nothing in the face of the ocean, he says, burnish the ego, right? And like a pearl, which is fascinating. I find Iqbal a fascinating thinker and very sort of challenging, of course, and frustrating in some ways, but also brilliant without question. And part of his brilliance is also lies in the fact that he, again, is able to raise these question marks vis-a-vis people who've gone before, but yeah, and a very sort of contemporary for his time, very contemporary meditation on the state of affairs, right?
And yeah, I mean, just to say, I mean, I mean, when I'm saying that he's Foucauldian in the sense,
yeah,
he's Foucauldian in the sense that, I mean, I mean, Foucault also famously criticized the modern subject on account that, you know, the modern subject has become preoccupied with the question of knowing thyself.
right.
And I mean, of course, know thyself was the famous, you know, Greek, you know, aphorism. But it that itself, Foucault says, if you look at ancient Greek philosophy, was itself a part of this larger project, which was the center of you know human life, which was cultivate thyself, or you know care for thyself. What he says in French, you know, epimile here too, of course. So self knowledge cannot happen in a vacuum or in this.
Very
I mean,
important.
the self is not something that lies out there, and you know just have to attain it in a sense, in a very timeless state. But through time you have to, through a set of spiritual exercises, or you know through a set of mental and psychological practices, you have to prepare yourself to become the self that you want to become. And I mean, in this sense, I mean, Iqbal is very Foucauldian in that sense.
Yeah, no, I love that that sort of interjection on your part. That the Foucauldian sort of contribution is, yeah, and this is also this has also been my sort of understanding of things as I've thought through stuff for myself, and just on a day-to-day basis, on an existential level, as it were. It's, is it enough, right? I mean, so I struggled for a long time, uh, you know, as a practicing Sufi, this with this notion of annihilation of the ego, and like it's sort of, it's unconscious to myself, but over time I began to realize that it was somehow self-punishing, right, and self-denigrating, and ultimately not healthy, right? And not sustainable in some ways. And maybe I just had I had a misconception of what Sufism was really about, or who knows. But the way at least I was sort of understanding it, the metaphor that not only the metaphor, but I remember reading in Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, I think it was in Tim Winter's translation of Breaking the Two Desires. He has this very powerful image of, I think I mentioned this to you before, right, of treating the self, the nafs, like one treats a dog, right? You only give it bones occasionally, and that's enough to keep it happy. And it's a very brutal sort of, very, very inhumane sort of image. And I've since reflected as someone who has a dog. I'm like, that's not how I treat my dog, And we have to be a bit more nurturing, a bit more loving. Maybe that made sense for that time, but everything has to be contextual as well, right? We don't live in Ghazali's time anymore. We don't. We have, for better or for worse, we have central heating, we have running water, we have electricity.
Antibiotics, of course. Anesthesia, antibiotics.
Right.
Of course, yeah.
We're a lot softer today. It's just a fact of life, So everything has to be contextual. So I think, I appreciate that sort of those comments on your part. Yeah.
So, I mean, just on a final note on this section, I remember reading recently in Iqbal's diary. Iqbal had a personal diary with him, which was later published as Stray Reflections. That's the title of the diary. So I remember reading at a point he says, "The weak lose themselves in God. The strong find Him in themselves."
Wow! Yeah, I love that.
This is the Iqbalian self.
Yeah. Well, this is a powerful conceit. I think that's a very powerful conceit, and this is I would tend to resonate with that conceit. Yeah.
Of course, moving on to technology, the question of technology, of course, which is central to your paper. I mean, the very idea of, I mean, recently, of course, you know that I was entertaining the idea of participating in a spiritual order through this virtual medium of Zoom, attending that spiritual meeting and gathering.
Right.
I mean, my concern, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was of the intangible gains that I want from a spiritual gathering. Of course, I'm not attending a spiritual gathering for the information that it might give me, which I might acquire from different sources, but of the suhbah, what is the company, and being in the presence of people. I mean, so of course the question is, what does this medium do for being in that presence, and that living, breathing presence of a human being? Of course, the tradition it is said that the tradition is transmitted from a heart to another heart. So how much, I mean, what does this medium do for that transmission?
Yeah, this is a very important question. Yeah, it's a powerful question. Something, again, I do think a lot about and ponder on. I'm tempted to say that it doesn't do much. I'm tempted to say, again, because of my traditionalist leanings and my sort of education through the traditionalist school. As you know, traditionalists historically, they have really they've really looked down upon modern technologies as such. I remember reading, I can't remember where it was from. It may have been from Titus Burckhardt. I could be wrong on that, so forgive me if I am wrong, but I feel that it was from a traditional source, reflecting on photographs, right? So the reflection was, to what extent can a photograph capture something of the real spiritual presence of a person, say a saint or a sage whom we're photographing, right? And the contention was, if this was indeed from Burckhardt, that it couldn't possibly capture the reality of that presence of that person. And I agree with that. I do agree. It can't, obviously, when we meet someone in person, it doesn't even have to be a sage, right? And we're all ultimately sages, right? We all have the divine within us. We have the divine names from an Islamic point of view. We're all created in the likeness of God from a Christian point of view, etc., etc. So we all carry something in sort of what's his famous Meister Eckhart's formulation, right? There's something in the soul which is uncreate and uncreatable, something of the divine spark within.
Yeah.
So by that very nature, to meet someone, anyone in person, is something of ultimately profound spiritual significance. Nevertheless, I tend to think that I tend to think the following, and that is that God, in its incredible love for us and mercy and wisdom, never leaves us to our own devices. God is always forever omnipresent, and that there is something of a divine economy always at play, that no matter what is happening outside around us on the horizontal plane, right? And I'm kind of, again, maybe slightly going to be contradicting myself a little bit, but so be it, right? Which is to say the following, that what we know from the Quran, right? The Quranic ethos is from this particular verse that God says about the plotters and the schemers, that they plot and scheme, but they forget that they themselves are part of the divine plan, right? So all these technologies, which have massive upsides and massive downsides at the same time, if we cultivate the correct intentionality, and I don't want to be kind of romantic about this either, because I will kind of stand by what I said earlier about the very sort of dark side of technology. But to the best of our ability, if we cultivate good intentions and we do the best that we can, given every situation that we're in, I think there can be something of the profound spiritual kind of alchemical conveyance, even through these means. I remember seeing this. This was a few years ago. This is way before COVID. This is going back to maybe even as far back as 2004, 2005. So this is a number of years ago, and I think this was around even before that, in the context of the Naqshbandi Tariqa, the Naqshbandi Haqqaniya, Sheikh Nazim al-Haqqani, who has, I think, something like 1 million disciples at least around the world. I myself was initiated into his tariq in one of the London mosques some years ago. And I remember when I was researching a little bit about them, this was for a project that I was considering working on, a research project. I remember seeing that one could, through the website, have spiritual initiation through the website. And I was like, I found that very strange. I was like, what does that even mean? But I wonder, and I didn't really delve further, to my discredit. I didn't delve further, even as a sort of, because I can't really speak with any authority on that at this point. But my thinking at the time was, that can't be right, given what I traditionally about initiation, things like that. But I wonder if there is a type of, I really tend to wonder these days, more on the affirmative, on the positive side, that there's something of a spiritual facilitation and that God intervenes, because we know the Sufis talk about this, right? Time and time again, how the hearts, they can connect and meet, regardless of spatial distance and time and things like that. So I wonder if we know, again, through prayers and meditation, that the prophetic presence, the prophet can be present through our very prayers, right? So why can't that be possible for like-minded hearts? And if we cultivate it enough and work on ourselves enough.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, if that transmission wasn't possible, then we wouldn't have connected in the first place. I mean, we wouldn't be having this conversation, or there's something of that element which is, keeping this together and keeping.
So to your point, I have learned so much online. So if putting aside the notion of sort of spiritual transmission in a sort of more lofty sense, and sometimes it's a lofty sense. So let's put that aside for the time being. I know for a fact in my own life, when I was even doing my PhD, and I sort of jokingly commented, had moments where I've commented, yeah, I wrote my dissertation basically by doing research online, and that was only slightly an exaggeration. That was actually
Yeah.
significantly true. I know, I can't remember if I mentioned this to you before, but I know that my dissertation would look very different if it were not for, like, I'm not saying it would be better or worse, but it would look very different from how it is. And I happen to be very proud of it. You know, it was actually offered some time ago. I never took up the offer to get it published just as it was, without any revision, which is very strange, unusual for a dissertation. I just got lazy. But by Oliver Lehman for.
Was it? Yeah, of course. And was it also on digitality, the dissertation?
No. So my
Yeah.
dissertation actually is on specifically on Hizb ut-Tahrir, but I have quite, as I tend to do, I have quite a big lens approach
Yeah.
to things. I'm really thinking through questions around modern subjectivity, modern Muslim subjectivity, modern subjectivity as such. I'm kind of using Hizb ut-Tahrir as a means to get into this topic. And I argue in the dissertation that, in my research, that the notion, excuse me, the notion of, what do I say? That modern Muslims, whether Islamic, political, or otherwise, are ultimately modern Western subjects. And my argument is that we are all thinking through, consciously or unconsciously, and this, you know, one can push back against this assumption, but that we're all thinking through modern Western paradigms, for better and for worse. Even someone like Iqbal, right? So it's just the air that we breathe. It's the kind of the window through which we're looking, and we assume, oh well, this, I get to see everything. We forget that. I mean, I wear glasses 99% of the time, 99.99 recurring percent of the time. I'm not even aware that I'm wearing glasses, you know. But I am wearing glasses. Like, if I take off the glasses, it's different. Anyway, you see what I'm saying. So
And of course, Foucault talks about the episteme.
Right.
Yeah.
And the episteme being, for those who are not.
The episteme being I mean, I'm very. This is a very rough rendition of the episteme, of course. I mean, my impression is that it refers to the inherited presuppositions which we already come from, and which you know, we might not be able to peer back at from our point of view, but only after this episteme has passed, or only I mean, only from a posterior point of view can you look back at it and see that, you know, what the episteme for what it was. From where we stand, we cannot look at it. We are within the water. I mean, we cannot look at the water.
Exactly. So I would argue, I mean, that's brilliant. That's a brilliant sketch there. I would sort of add this additional fold, which Foucault wouldn't add, of course, given his kind of own subjectivity, and which is in keeping with what we've discussed thus far. I would add this fold, which is, we can begin to look at the episteme through a critical lens if we come at it from a spiritual dimension. If we kind of try to like from the vertical dimensions, I'm not saying it's going to be perfect, but we can begin to really look at it. And look, Foucault, for all his pronouncements, he himself was able to raise question marks about the episteme, right? So he certainly wasn't traditionally spiritual in any ways that we would necessarily recognize. I think he had his own path, of course. But yeah.
Yes. Sorry, can you just remind me what we were speaking of before this? Because I had some really interesting question too.
So we were speaking about. I've sort of lost the thread. I remember you wanted to raise some questions about the notion of the illusion of freedom, perhaps.
Yes,
the Cartesian conceit. I can't remember.
Yeah, I can't remember as well. Well, of course, I mean, we can just move on to the question of freedom, of course.
Sure, yeah.
And well, I think we were just talking about the. I mean, just to recall what I was talking about. I mean, of course, I mean, we can edit this out at the end if we want.
That's fine, yeah.
We were talking about digitality and those things, and I don't remember exactly.
That's okay.
What it was. Yeah,
If it comes back, it comes back. If it doesn't,
of course. Yeah, but I mean, I just remember it was something very interesting. So
no worries. Inshallah, another time. I'm sure it'll
of
come
course,
back. I'm sure we'll have more
yeah,
discussions.
of course,
And then we can slowly wrap up as well. So yeah,
yeah, sure,
yeah, yeah.
of course.
So,
So
so yeah,
coming to freedom,
yeah.
um, uh, so you had mentioned the Panopticon and that model of and the surveillance society that we live in, and the and of course the social media and I mean, all these social platforms. Uh, the, I mean, these are. I mean, in one sense, I suppose it can be said that the Facebook is not the product, but uh, we are the products that are. Of course, it is our attention that is being bought and sold over here. I
Yes,
mean,
yes, yes,
and it is our attention, our choices. Choice is manufactured. Consent is manufactured, as you mentioned.
yes, yes, yes.
And I mean, human beings are programmed in very, very clear terms. I mean, human beings are programmed. I mean, if something can influence your decision about what you're going to do next, or who you're going to vote, of course you're being programmed with it.
Yes.
Uh, so, what does this say about our freedom? And I mean, this is to do with external freedom as well, but also, I mean, what about the internal freedom? The kind of what spirituality talks about, the freedom that comes with self mastery, with being with having mastered yourself, or not being a slave of your desires or your inclinations or your whims. So
Yeah, no, thanks for that again. That's very poignant on your part. Yeah, no, I think the sort of the conceit that the different religious spiritual traditions have, each tradition has this without question, whether it's Hinduism, whether it's Judaism, whether it's Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Sikhism, the one can go on and on. There is a deep, profound notion that we really achieve all that we can be, not through giving into our baser desires, the sort of inclinations of the stomach and the genitals, as Ghazali would put it,
mm,
but through transcending those desires which are fundamental to life and living, right? We need to eat, right, in order to survive. We need to procreate in order for the species to continue. However, if we become obsessed with those things, and I would contend, and others have argued this point, that we live in an age, and increasingly so, that gives more priority to these baser desires than anything else, right? Whereas the traditional religious spiritual perspective is, it's through self-mastery, as you rightly point out, through disciplinary practices that have been historically perfected, not accidentally, right? So whether we take a social evolutionary view of things, or whether we believe in the notion of revelation and descent in that sense, whichever our perspective, we have to accept that these disciplinary practices have stood the test of time. They've been with us for centuries, right? And it's not by accident, right? It's because they work that they're still around, right? If they didn't work, they would have been lost, long lost, right? We know that fasting works. It's to my mind a fascinating fact of religious history, or history as such, human history, that every single religious tradition has fasting as a disciplinary practice. That cannot be accidental, right?
yeah,
The idea of physical disciplinary practices, we again know through Foucault that how our bodies are disciplined, right? And he spends a lot of time looking at the modern disciplinary practices in the prison systems, in the schools, and this, that, and the other. Right now, I'm using a makeshift standing desk. It's a very different experience for me standing talking to you right now, as opposed to what it would be like sitting for me at a chair, on a chair at the table.
yeah,
It would be very different for me if I were to be sitting on the floor. So the disciplinary physical practices are not accidental, and we must be more conscious in how we apply those disciplinary practices in our lives. And when I say when we should be more conscious, I would say incorporating the disciplinary practices that have been handed down to us through the ages from any one of these spiritual traditions, sometimes combining different practices. I know this is a historic fact that there were Sufis in India, Muslim sages, who incorporated yogic practices into their spiritual practices. So I think we have to be more creative and more sort of I don't accept the kind of the notion that I think fatwas were given by a group of scholars in Malaysia some years ago. Was it Malaysia or Indonesia, saying yoga was haram? And more recently, I know one of the Eastern Orthodox sort of figures, very significant people, they made the pronouncement that yoga was not un-Christian, things like that. I can understand where they're coming from. I can understand it, but personally, that has not been true for me. I think anyway. So to answer your question, there's no life without disciplinary practices. So the way I understand it, whether we are conscious in how we adopt our discipline, because if I, as a postmodern subject living in the West, right, the traditional disciplinary practices that I apply in my life will be applied only because I choose to do so, right? It's only because I've actively made the conscious decision to have my, say, yogic practice or my Salah practice or what have you, right? Standing in prayer in the Orthodox tradition, whatever the case may be. It's not because I'm being told I have to do it, right? My point being, we either choose to have consciously applied disciplinary practices, however we choose them for ourselves, or the modern subject is always already being fashioned by virtue of sitting in front of these technologies, by virtue of sitting in chairs. And I don't think it's a small thing to sit in a chair. It seems like it's an insignificant thing as we say it, but it's actually, it has massive consequence in terms of our subject formations. So I don't know if that answers exactly your question, but there's some sort of thoughts I've had on this topic for a while now.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, these are, I mean, in terms of subject formation, of course, I mean, our practices, our postures, I mean, if you think about it in that sense, that whatever you're doing, I mean, every act is a part of this larger subject formation that you're doing for yourself. Then, I mean, things seem very significant. I mean, just having a Facebook account itself. I mean, for example, I was mentioning it to you. I mean, what the effects that I felt it having on my own, I mean, I was observing. I didn't like what I was becoming because of that. I mean, but this is only something I became aware of. But I mean, I'm sure there are so many things I'm not aware of that also influence who I become.
Well, you're thinking. I've said this before. You're a deeply thinking, reflective human being. I assure you, sadly, most of us are not thinking about these things. And we can't not think about these things. Now, these things are not neutral. I mean, there's this dominant narrative, which we hear all too often, and it's a very unthinking. It's not well thought out at all. Which is that technology is neutral. It's just a case of using it. I mean, I kind of edged in that direction. I was like, oh, it's about correct intentionality. So it's like I'm aware of the deep contradictions, and maybe to be a human being is to be contradictory sometimes. I know I struggle with, life is paradoxical, but yeah, I mean, technology is never neutral, and the people who are behind these technologies are not neutral. Therefore, whenever they're building these technologies, whether consciously or unconsciously, they're imbuing their technologies with their worldviews. And the very recent, within the last 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks now, I think, sort of news story about this significant AI ethics researcher at Google. I forget the lady's name now, a woman of color. She was fired from her position at Google, and she claims because she was raising question marks about Google's ethical standards vis-a-vis AI. And she's not the only one. I remember reading about this a few years ago now, that there are very serious problems vis-a-vis AI and its racial biases. This is a big problem.
Mm,
So whoever builds the technology, consciously or unconsciously, is going to be imparting their biases into it. And everyone who subsequently uses those technologies is going to be impacted by those biases, whether we like it or not. There's no denying it. Right? And the more recent also news reports about these facial recognition AI technologies in China being used against disproportionately being used to identify the Uyghurs and to signal them out. And we know what's happening to them. They are being ethnically cleansed, and there's no question about it, right? So
yeah, and of course, I think we were speaking about this earlier as well. The especially with the, I mean, in response to COVID-19, the dramatic shift that the world has made onto the digital world. This will only facilitate any dystopian future if it is going to come.
yeah
Of course,
yeah
uh, and that's not really such a big leap. I mean, we're only protected from it to the extent that we are in the present because of the mercy of those who control these things. And
Yeah,
hence that is
I
possible.
mean, honestly, I tend to be optimistic because I tend certainly more towards a religious spiritual view of things, but
Yeah.
the pragmatist in me is not hopeful for our short to well for our long-term futures collectively as a species, especially for people of color, especially for Muslims. I'm not hopeful.
Mm,
Really, I mean, if the stuff that's happening in China is anything to go on, I mean, I don't think it's an aberration. You know, we have major companies like Google uh, being enlisted and have been enlisted in creating a lot of these surveillance technologies in China. It's not accidental,
of course, yeah.
right? So we'll see. We'll have to wait and see. Well, I mean, we shouldn't just wait and see. I think we should pray first and foremost. We should be vigilant. We should think creatively. Honestly,
Mm,
think outside the box. Like, what is the solution? There has to be a solution. There has to be also practical solutions. I don't want to overemphasize the
yeah.
spiritual at the expense of the practical. I think the two have to go hand in hand. There has to be creative on our part. We have to have creative, practical solutions to these incredible existential crises that we're only beginning to wake up to, and these are only going to intensify. These narratives are pervasive and prevalent. One of the narratives being, of course, that human beings are the problem. We're a virus. We're a parasite on this earth. And that is not a religious spiritual perspective. No one can show anyone from any one of these traditions, whether it's Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, any of these traditions, that human beings are the problem. We're created in God's image. We're caliphs of God. We contain the divine within us. We're children of God. How can we be the problem? But this is a narrative that's being pushed forward now. No, I mean, it's a demonic narrative. The reality is corporations are the problem. Corporations are destroying the environment. No, and yes, as a Westerner, I certainly have a far greater contribution to global carbon emissions than the average Bangladeshi, shall we say. My parents are originally from Bangladesh. That's absolutely true. However, relative to what the corporations are producing, no, I don't see anywhere being mentioned, oh, the corporations are the problem. No, it's human beings are the problem. Too many people on the planet. Elon Musk recently in an interview in Germany where he was given an award, he was asked, what he considered to be the major sort of existential threats that humanity faces. And one of them he said this is counterintuitive, he admitted, is that there aren't enough people. He was like, he was actually saying, no, we're actually heading towards population collapse. You see?
Of course,
But the
yeah.
narrative that's being pushed, even by people like David Attenborough in his sort of, Sir David Attenborough is so widely lauded as, I mean, he's done some incredible work, but he's kind of buying into this narrative with his most recent documentary on Netflix. Too many people. I don't accept that narrative. That's a demonic narrative because that's the beginning of eugenics. That's the beginning of because if it starts off with too many people, then all very quickly edge into, well, we can't get rid of every person under the sun. So let's start with the undesirable, the unsavory people. So who are the unsavory people that we can't have? And I'm sure it doesn't take a huge leap of the imagination to draw conclusions about who those people are going to be, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I just remembered I think the thing that I had forgotten.
Yeah, your question.
Maybe we can just end with this. I mean, this is more on a more lighter note. You were mentioning about the Sufi order in which you said that they offer initiation through website, right?
Yeah.
And of course, I think you might be aware that Nuhamin Keller
He does the
also
same.
offers. I mean, yeah, he does it through a phone call.
Interesting.
And I've also heard him say that he actually doesn't believe that the telephone medium or the audio medium, at least, for example, audio tapes. I mean, he also mentions that of his own sheikh, the most benefit he found was not through direct person meetings, but through listening to his lectures or his tapes.
Oh, interesting.
And so he actually believes in the power of the audio cassette to transmit the spiritual barakah. But for some reason, he can't make that leap to the visual medium. And of course, I mean, he has his reasons for that, and I mean that brings another whole set of issues with it. But I think it again is an inevitability, and I mean, avoiding it is, I mean, doesn't seem like any solution to it, at least.
Right. Well, no. So this is a paradoxical. I mean, this is one of the paradoxes of being a spiritual. Oh, yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Saad? I can hear you. Can you hear me? Oh, hello.
Hello.
Oh, yeah. I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, I think, one of the paradoxes of being a religious, spiritual human being, or a human being as such, right? So on the one hand, there is a type of inevitability of these technologies intensifying, right? Because this is kind of the general thrust, the energy that's been put into these technologies. And there's something I didn't talk about, which I was thinking originally of mentioning in my presentation originally, was something that both Jacques Ellul talks about, but also more recently Kevin Kelly, who's a very influential Silicon Valley. I mean, in that sort of realm, he's kind of, as it were, one of their intellectuals. He's the founder of Wired magazine, has written different books and different very influential lectures. He also has this notion that, for instance, as described in his book, What Technology Wants. So the idea is that technology itself has its own demands on us, right? Kelly has this notion of the technium. He describes what he calls like the fifth kingdom, which is the sum total of all the technologies in existence, and that they form a type of superorganism, right, which is almost living and breathing, and it has its own requirements, and that we have to be feeding, and it places its demands on us. So from that point of view, it's almost like there's a type of inevitability to some of these technologies coming about. I know that in Silicon Valley, the kind of unspoken and sometimes explicitly mentioned idea is that people are working towards the creation of artificial superintelligence. And this is just known, right? That this is the end goal. We want to have, it has to be automated, everything automated to the point where literally we don't even have to think for ourselves. Our thinking itself will be done for ourselves, which is, I think, a very demonic. It's a very demonic notion, and one has to think how it is that technology. I mean, it's fascinating. The human creature is such an interesting creature in that we can literally imbue our own creations with a type of life, right? Which then takes on its own agency almost. I mean, we have now artificially intelligent systems that are improving themselves. And there was an example famously a few years ago, I think it was in Facebook, where they had these two AI chatbots. They're talking to each other. They had to stop it because they were speaking in a language that the programmers could no longer understand. So they had to end it. So anyway, that's to the point of the inevitability. But I don't know. Is it inevitable? Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. To what extent do we align ourselves with these technologies? I think we ultimately, as individuals, have to make our own choices, right? I think some people will be able to have less of this technology in their lives than others. I think it's also a question of calling, right? I think my calling is necessarily going to be unique to me. Your calling is going to be necessarily unique to yourself, and it's down to ourselves, in conversation with one another and with our mentors and teachers and friends and so forth, to try and figure out what our calling is and to work accordingly. So I think it's going to be different for different people, but it's kind of paradoxical. Yeah.
And I think throughout the whole discussion, we've clearly seen that we've had to take very paradoxical stance.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't. I mean, to affirm one position and to deny the other would be very simplistic and would be very unsatisfactory even for ourselves. We
Yeah.
would want to affirm both of them, but
Yeah.
I mean, we would want to both deny and accept both of them. And I mean, on a final note, this reminds me again of something from Iqbal, and of course he was echoing Emerson, who said that uh, something to the effect that only stones do not contradict themselves. That's what Emerson said. So I mean, Iqbal also says that, if I contradict myself, then very well I contradict myself, because I am a living and thinking being.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No, I appreciate that. I tend to resonate with that for sure. Yeah.
yeah,
Life is paradoxical, and the way I understand it, look, to be a human being is the very first contradiction, because I tend to have a religious spiritual view of things. I am
yeah,
a spirit in a physical body. That's the very first contradiction right there.
of
that's what started the whole paradox of
yeah,
life, right? So,
yeah.
and which brings us neatly, I think, back to the symbolism of the cross, right? So the spirit, which is the vertical, is penetrating the horizontal, which is the physical, and so we have to kind of work that out. And there isn't an easy working out of that. I mean, anyone who, if I've sometimes tended towards an easy solution, then I'm wrong. No, there can't be an easy working out of that situation. Nevertheless, at the same time, I think we have to remind ourselves that the divine facility is always present, and that ultimately God is in charge. I really believe that. And to the extent that we can rely upon the divine and turn ourselves over to the divine and surrender to the divine, to that extent, life somehow flows more easily.